A single sentence, that is all it took. Not a declaration of war, not a missile launch, not a diplomatic cable intercepted at midnight in some glass tower in Geneva. A single sentence delivered in the French language by a 36-year-old military officer in the landlocked nation of Burkina Faso, a nation most Western news desks cannot place on a map without checking Google first. The sentence was simple: the fire does not ask permission before it crosses the border. That one forensic signal. And every major Western outlet missed it entirely. They were too busy covering the smoke to notice who was pointing at the flame. The world saw this as a regional conflict, a familiar story filed under Middle East tensions. In the permanent archive of global crises, we are trained to expect, to accept, and ultimately to forget. But the data tells a structurally different story. This is not simply about missiles and borders in a distant region. What the data actually suggests is that we are witnessing the stress testing of an entire global order, a legacy framework of post-Cold War institutions, energy dependencies, trade architectures, and military alliances that was already cracking before the first shot was fired. And sitting in Ouagadougou, a man named Ibrahim Traore has been reading those stress fractures with a precision that shames the analysts on the major networks. He is not angry, not defiant in the performative sense. He is forensic. And that is far more dangerous to the existing power calculus than anger ever could be. My friends, by the end of this video, you will understand the hidden architecture of the current Middle East crisis, its logistics nodes, its financial signatures, and its cascading impact on the global South that big media refuses to touch. Let us establish the crime scene before we examine the evidence. The Middle East, forensically speaking, is not a region, it is a mechanism. It produces approximately 33% of the world's crude oil supply, routes roughly 20% of globally traded goods through the Suez Canal corridor alone, and hosts military installations from no fewer than 6 external global powers: the United States, Russia, France, the United Kingdom, Turkey, and China. It is, in the language of systems analysis, a Tier 1 global logistics node. And Tier 1 global logistics nodes do not experience crises in isolation. The current escalation cycle, tracked across Gaza, Lebanon, the Red Sea corridor, and the broader Iran-Israel-Saudi Arabian triangular power contest, did not begin recently. It has been building along a measurable fault line since at least 2011, the year the Arab Spring began reshuffling the power architecture of the region in ways that Western foreign policy institutions were fundamentally unprepared to manage. The International Monetary Fund logged a 17 percentage point deterioration in regional economic stability indicators across the Middle East and North Africa zone between 2011 and 2020. That is not a blip, that is a structural decline. That is the long, slow earthquake that arrives before the visible destruction. But why did the fire accelerate precisely when it did? The answer lies in the simultaneous convergence of 3 structural failures. The first was the American strategic repositioning away from the Middle East, which created a power vacuum in the regional deterrence architecture that Iran, Russia, Turkey, and non-state armed groups moved rapidly to fill. Power vacuums in Tier 1 logistics nodes always manifest eventually in physical confrontation. The second failure was the Abraham Accords normalization framework, hailed breathlessly as a diplomatic breakthrough, which convinced non-signatory regional actors that the window for reshaping the regional order was closing. When actors believe a window is closing, they accelerate action. The major networks sold the Accords as an unambiguous good news story with no forensic examination of the structural consequences. The third failure was the energy price supercycle of 2021 to 2023, which generated extraordinary windfall revenues for Gulf state producers, funded an unprecedented regional arms procurement cycle, and made domestic leaders far less responsive to external diplomatic pressure. When you are swimming in oil revenue, you are less afraid of economic consequences. That changes the risk calculation entirely. These 3 failures did not happen independently. They compounded each other in a feedback loop that produced the present moment. Ibrahim Traore understood this dynamic better than most, because Burkina Faso has been living with the downstream consequences of Middle Eastern power instability for its entire modern history. The terrorist insurgency that destabilized Burkina Faso and triggered Traore's rise to power was itself, in significant part, a product of the 2011 Libya destabilization, a conflict directly linked to Western military intervention in the Middle East-North Africa corridor. Traoré is not observing the Middle East crisis from the outside. He's observing it as a downstream casualty reading the upstream source code. To understand why his warning is systemically significant, we have to trace the hidden data chain that connects events in Beirut, in Tehran, in the Strait of Hormuz, and ultimately in Ouagadougou, in Bamako, in Niamey, and in every capital across the African continent. This is the chain the major Western outlets do not map for their audiences, and there is a reason they do not. When conflict enters the Middle East system, the first visible signal arrives in the global energy markets within 48 to 72 hours. This is documented, repeatable market behavior across every major Middle East escalation event since 1973. The oil price spike that follows transmits immediately into the cost structure of every petroleum-dependent economy on the planet. Sub-Saharan Africa is disproportionately exposed because African economies have far less capacity to absorb energy price shocks through strategic reserves, currency hedging, or domestic energy substitution. The World Bank estimates that a sustained 20% increase in global oil prices reduces GDP growth in oil-importing sub-Saharan African countries by an average of 1.5 percentage points annually. In economies already growing at 3 to 4% annually, that is not a rounding error. That is a structural blow. Beyond energy, the Middle East is a critical node in global fertilizer supply chains. Saudi Arabia and Iran are among the world's largest fertilizer producers, and Russia, the world's largest fertilizer exporter, has its own deep entanglement in Middle East power dynamics. Africa imports approximately 60% of its fertilizer needs from supply chains dependent upon this stability. Disruption is a food security crisis with a 6 to 12-month lag time. Traoré's Burkina Faso already has over 5 million citizens facing acute food insecurity, according to the World Food Programme. A Middle East escalation that fractures fertilizer supply chains is not a distant abstraction for these people. It is the difference between survival and catastrophe. The third node in our analytical chain is the Suez Canal, through which approximately 12% of global trade by volume passes annually. When Houthi forces began attacking commercial shipping in the Red Sea approaches, major carriers rerouted around the Cape of Good Hope, adding 10 to 14 days to shipping times and dramatically increasing freight costs. This rerouting provided essentially zero economic benefit to African port infrastructure. African economies simply paid higher import prices, once again a crisis originating elsewhere that Africa paid for without choosing to participate in. This is the forensic pattern Traoré has spent his political career naming. My friends, pause here for just one moment. What you are receiving right now is not the kind of analysis you will find in a 3-minute cable news segment. If you value independent forensic analysis that preserves this kind of institutional memory, the kind that does not get silenced by advertising contracts or editorial capture, then subscribe to this channel. Hit the notification bell. The link for direct support is in the description. Now let us continue, because the second half of this story is where the architecture of what comes next begins to crystallize. To understand Traoré's warning in its full forensic dimension, we must examine him not as a political personality, but as a strategic actor whose behavior follows a coherent analytical model. Traoré came to power in Burkina Faso's second military coup of 2022 alone. A country that experiences 2 coups in 8 months is a country in which the legacy framework of post-colonial governance has catastrophically failed to deliver security, economic stability, or sovereign agency. What is forensically significant is not the coups themselves, but the analytical framework Traoré has publicly articulated, a coherent systems-level critique of what he calls the architecture of dependency that locks African nations into permanent vulnerability to external shocks. He has argued consistently that Burkina Faso cannot achieve genuine security without genuine sovereignty, defined as economic control over resources and genuine military autonomy. Burkina Faso had French Special Operations Forces deployed on its territory through the Barkhane counterterrorism operation, operating under arrangements that gave France significant latitude over deployment and rules of engagement. When those arrangements failed to stop the insurgency, when jihadist groups continued expanding despite years of French military partnership, Traoré's data-driven conclusion was clear. The arrangement was not designed to produce Burkinabe security. It was designed to produce French strategic influence. The insurgency expanded. French forces remained. Casualties mounted. This exact logic, identifying who benefits most from a structural arrangement, is precisely how Traoré reads the Middle East crisis. He is asking who benefits from the perpetuation of this conflict and who pays the costs while others extract the value. Burkina Faso is Africa's fourth largest gold producer, with approximately 60 tons exported annually and revenues of roughly $4 billion per year. Under the previous governance arrangements, the overwhelming majority of those revenues left Burkina Faso through mining concessions held by multinational corporations with royalty arrangements that returned a modest percentage to the Burkinabe state. Traoré has explicitly framed the renegotiation of these arrangements as a sovereignty project. The same analytical framework applies globally. When energy markets spike due to Middle East instability, the beneficiaries are the major oil producers and the financial institutions holding commodity futures contracts. The losers are the net energy importers of the global south. The structural architecture of global commodity markets transfers wealth from resource-dependent consumer economies to resource-controlling producer economies during every crisis cycle. Traoré is pointing at this architecture and naming it. Perhaps the most geopolitically significant element of Traoré's framework is his repositioning of Burkina Faso within the emerging new geometry of global alliances. In 2023, Burkina Faso formally terminated its military partnership with France and expelled French forces from its territory, following the same pattern established by Mali and Niger. This coordinated expulsion of French military presence from the Sahel was one of the most significant geopolitical events on the African continent in decades, and yet it received remarkably little analytical depth in major Western media. In the place of French security partnerships, the alliance of Sahel states has been building new relationships with Russia's Africa Corps, with Turkey, and with Gulf state actors. This is the hidden linkage most Western analysis of Traoré misses entirely. Burkina Faso's new security relationships are deeply entangled with the very actors whose behavior in the Middle East is driving the current escalation cycle: Russia, Turkey, Iran-aligned networks. The same forces reshaping the Middle East are simultaneously reshaping the security architecture of the Sahel. When Traoré warns that the Middle East crisis will not stay in the Middle East, he is speaking as a man whose country is already operating inside the new alliance architecture that the Middle East crisis is accelerating. That is the fact that no major outlet has connected. The Middle East crisis is functioning as an accelerant for structural transitions in the global order that were already underway. For over 5 decades, since the 1973 petrodollar arrangements, global oil trade has been denominated overwhelmingly in US dollars, giving the United States the structural privilege of running persistent trade deficits without the currency crises that would otherwise result. But that system has been showing measurable stress signals. China and Saudi Arabia concluded a landmark currency swap agreement in 2023 contemplating the settlement of bilateral oil trade in Chinese yuan. The expanded BRICS grouping, now including Iran, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and Ethiopia, has been discussing alternative currency settlement mechanisms to reduce dollar dependency. Every time Western governments deploy financial sanctions as a geopolitical tool, every observing nation calculates its own vulnerability to the same weapon. Saudi Arabia is now explicitly hedging its currency exposure by denominating more trade in alternative currencies, a financial signature of the First Order. NATO's strategic consensus is under strain. Hungary maintains relationships with Russia and China that conflict with NATO solidarity. Turkey has deepened its relationship with Russia, and France has been articulating a European defense framework implying independence from American strategic leadership. The dominant narrative architecture of global events is fragmenting as independent channels provide fundamentally different framings of the same events. The ability to define the narrative of a crisis is a form of power, and that power is being redistributed in real time. Let us now map the forward scenarios with forensic precision. In the first scenario, the escalation cycle is contained through back-channel diplomacy, economic pressure from major powers, and the exhaustion of the warring parties' appetite for continued conflict. Global economic impacts are significant but temporary. African economies recover as energy markets normalize. For Traoré and the Sahel Alliance, this validates the warning without producing the structural rupture that might dramatically accelerate the new power architecture they are betting on. In the second scenario, the conflict expands, drawing in additional regional actors and producing sustained disruptions to energy and shipping logistics. Oil prices spiked to levels unseen since the 2008 commodity supercycle peak. A sustained increase in global food prices, layered on top of existing food insecurity affecting millions, is a humanitarian catastrophe in the making. In the third scenario, the one major outlets will not map for you. The escalation triggers wider military engagement by external powers. The structural transitions already underway accelerate catastrophically. The legacy frameworks of global governance, the United Nations Security Council, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, are exposed as inadequate for managing the scale of the disruption. In this scenario, Traoré's warning does not look like the warning of a regional leader punching above his geopolitical weight. It looks like the warning of the only analyst who was reading the structural data clearly while everyone else was managing the narrative. My friends, let us arrive at the conclusion of this forensic audit with the same precision with which we began. Ibrahim Traore issued a stark warning. The Middle East crisis, he said, would not remain the Middle East's crisis. The fire does not ask permission before it crosses the border. We have traced the logistics nodes through which that fire travels, the energy transmission mechanism delivering every oil price spike to the budgets of the poorest countries on earth, the food security chain linking a fertilizer plant in the Persian Gulf to a farmer in Burkina Faso, the shipping corridor connecting a missile in the Red Sea to the price of rice in Lagos. We have examined the power calculus of the new actors reshaping the global order, the alliance frameworks built outside legacy institutions, the currency systems architected around the dollar's structural vulnerabilities, the information ecosystems constructed outside the editorial control of Western media gatekeepers. We have mapped the scenarios through which the current crisis may evolve and what each means for the billion people of the African continent who will pay the price for decisions made in capitals thousands of kilometers from their homes. Ibrahim Traore is 36 years old. He leads one of the world's poorest nations, a nation in the grip of a security crisis that has displaced millions. His governance record is deeply contested and legitimately subject to criticism from human rights and democratic governance frameworks. But his analytical framework, his reading of the structural architecture of global power, of the transmission mechanisms connecting distant crises to local realities, of the sovereignty calculus determining who pays for conflicts they did not choose, is forensically coherent, grounded in observable data, and predicting consequences that the major analytical institutions have been consistently slow to acknowledge. The decisions being made today in the war rooms of the Middle East and the energy markets of Houston and Riyadh will shape global stability for years. History records that the warnings were issued. It records who heard them and who dismissed them. The forensic record is being built, and history will note who was paying attention. Leave your answer in the comments. If the next major global crisis strikes within the next 5 years, which institution do you believe has the structural capacity to manage it? And if the answer is none of them, what does accountability look like in an era when the legacy frameworks have broken down, but the replacements have not yet been built?